everybody. I hope you can hear me. It's strange because I see myself in my view, and then I see myself on the screen view in New York City. But thanks. I'm really honored to have been asked to participate in the panel today, especially with all of the other dope folks who are here who are going to be talking about their work. Um, so I am one of the co-founders of Cooperation Jackson. I'm based in Jackson, Mississippi. I've been moved here about 5.5 years ago as a part of this political project. Um, Cooperation Jackson is, we see ourselves as an emerging vehicle for um, economic democracy, sustainable community development, community ownership, and stewardship, really, I would say. And Cooperation Jackson vision is to build a solidarity economy here in Jackson, Mississippi, and for that to reverberate throughout the South. We come out of a Black radical tradition, and our work really builds on the legacy of folks who have come before us who have been fighting for Black self-determination here in the United States for African people. And so Cooperation Jackson, we're building a web of interrelated and interconnected projects. One of the main crux of it, as you can tell by the name, for people who don't know, Cooperation Jackson are cooperatives, particularly worker cooperatives, and we feel like a democratic kind of a way that has already been established is a way for us to, I think, kind of like ignite so many different things and pieces of how our lives connect with the economy, with governance, with healing relationships, and reshaping how we relate to each other, how we relate to land, and how we work together collectively. I'm trying to make sure I stay on time since I know we have a lot of people who have a lot of things to say. I want to share briefly a little bit about Jackson, Mississippi, for those who may not know. Jackson is a small city. It's the capital of Mississippi. It's about 200,000 people, give or take. The city is about 80% Black, so it's still a majority Black city. Um, in the South, the area median income at the time that I had these numbers was about $28,000. We're located, our base, although we're cover all of Jackson, our base is really in West Jackson, and in West Jackson, in one of the census tracts, the area median income is like $16,000, and so the majority of people in Jackson are working class, poor, Black folks, and at a time, so unlike some of the other major cities when Black folks were leaving the South and going to places like Detroit and Chicago, where it was at a time when the U.S. economy was expanding, Jackson became a majority Black city at a time when the economy was contracting during deindustrialization. And although Jackson became a majority Black city in the 80s, political, that didn't show up in terms of political activity and I guess power. I wouldn't necessarily say power, but power for lack of a better word right now, um, um, until the um, until the until like late '97. So the first Black mayor in Jackson was elected in 1997. Um, And so while Jackson was shifting demographically to become a majority Black city, um, white flight was happening, Black middle class flight was happening. The tax base was very much drained from Jackson. A lot of divestment was happening. Although this is the capital, the state of Mississippi has a very negative relationship with the city because of its Black majority. Structural racism and economic power and wealth and the markets all were continued to be controlled by the white plantation previously plantation owners class, and deliberately withheld from the city, and resources are actually like deliberately extracted from the city. So large sections of Jackson became blighted and vacant, and pretty much left Jackson with chronic employment, unemployment, a very depressed housing market, poorly performing schools. The infrastructure is very antiquated, and all of those things are still issues that Jackson is trying to overcome. Um, um, and Mississippi itself at one point was like the wealthiest state in the nation, and Mississippi, um, you know, now is pretty much always noted for being at the bottom or at the very near bottom of every major quality of life indicator, like health and housing and transportation and workers' rights and education and access. And so um, the political climate is and has been very oppressive, repressive um, for forever. We're in a Tea Party state. The Republicans have a supermajority um, in the state, and so one of the things that we kind of like have jokingly talked about when Trump became president of the United States was like, "Welcome to Mississippi." Like this is what people in Mississippi have been experiencing all this time, and so the fighting part, like we have um, we have a kind of like a build and fight program and model, and we know how important it is to continue fighting, and we've been fighting, and folks um, have been able to make all kinds of gains through um, that's my timer, have been able to make all kinds of gains. And at the same time, like the strategy that the Cooperation Jackson comes out of the Jackson Kush plan was really about creating a vision of building towards self-determination and building alternatives. And so we have three different cooperatives that are at different stages. One is the Freedom Farms Urban Farming Cooperative. There's the Green Team Landscaping and Small Composting Cooperative. We have an emerging fabrication laboratory that will be doing small manufacturing, amongst other things. And that's the lab is developing like 3D printing, precision cutting. We have developed our Fannie Lou Hamer Community Land Trust, which has over 40 pieces of property in this West Jackson area, immediately around our like base center. The majority of the land is vacant land. You can drive around and just kind of like picture being on one block and it looking like what you would typically think of a residential neighborhood with housing and people, and then you can turn the corner and be on a block that is totally vacant, and the land has actually like reclaimed has like the earth has like reclaimed the land. And so one of the things for us is like we're not building co-ops for co-op's sakes. The community land trust is a tool, but like really what we're starting to see now. Um, besides just like the abandonment that has happened for so long, is that so many places all over the country, and even in other parts of the world, that like folks want to reclaim the city, right? And reclaim the city means mass displacement of our folks, and so through gentrification. And so our program is really about just about creating from the ground up level an alternative, and to have the supporting network of the systems, and all the different pieces and aspects that impact our lives that are a part of it, be built, by us and for us, and really to have a just transition away from this capitalist extractive economy that is extracting our Mother Earth's resources, destroying, like extracting our bodies, extracting our labor, um, and um, and so I'm gonna wrap up there because I think that's like almost at 10 minutes. I can see you nodding your head, but hopefully we'll get to interact and exchange more, because a lot of the work that we do actually touches on bits and pieces of the different people who are going to be talking next.
Panwarado. I'm gonna speak in my language first, so don't panic. What panwarado? Tsagwas na yujats na waganya. To agata so dating zone si dating warado na yaki isang hunsan. Sa sara so area. Ano why this one. Ano ko the water. So because we traditionally do openings in our language and introduce ourselves, and I'm Turtle Clan. Actually, not coming from Montreal. It's about 62 kilometers northwest of Montreal, the community in Gunnesadag. And I wanted to talk to you a bit about some of the struggles that Indigenous people in Canada face, and the similarities of how we are the invisible minorities in the US. When people talk and have discussions, there is no inclusion of the kinds of history of why we are where we're at right now, the intent to destroy our languages, our culture, and our very fabric of our identity. So one of the things that the American dream, and I think that we start to hear that now in Canada, which I never heard before, the Canadian dream, um, is based on racist superiority that comes from long before any of us were born, which are the doctrine of discovery, Perennius, which have been invalidated and have been found morally reprehensible by the United Nations. And so the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues has made many reports, and one of the reports was on the doctrine of discovery. And it says it's incompatible with justice, equality, democracy. Canada looks like it's a good country, but as you can see, they've just bought a pipeline company, and it's going to run through Indigenous people's lands again. The prosperity of the U.S. and Canada, and indeed all of Latin America, by European nations and by the states themselves, like Canada and the U.S., has been based upon genocide. The UN's first UN Special Rapporteur, Rudolfo Stavenhagen, did some research and said after a century of contact with Europeans, three-quarters of the indigenous population were wiped out. So for us, the language, the knowledge that's embedded in the language, we see so much that was lost. And what we do have today is actually pretty amazing, but it's still being threatened because colonization didn't stop. It continues. And so assimilation policies continue. And the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women report that recently came out talked about genocide. There's been a Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1995. There was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which dealt with the Indian residential schools. But yet nothing has changed in Canada, really. I think the population has become more aware. And if we look at something that also affects the US, is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's something that Canada and the US have both endorsed, and now it's up to them to implement it in their domestic legislation. Because one of the things that we see is that you cannot have a justice system if it's totally adversarial to Indigenous peoples. So for us to protect our sovereignty, and it's a sovereignty that is based upon respect for the land and respect for the people. It's not the sovereignty that the U.S. or Canada has been talking about, which is extraction of the resources so that you're not leaving anything for future generations. So the sovereignty we're talking about is the respect for that we are part of nature, we are part of that environmental balance. And Indigenous people and elders have been saying for a long time, you have to stop the way you are treating the earth. And at one point, the late elder Thomas Benyanka, the Hopi elder, said, I've come here and warned you many times, and now the time is past for you to be able to pass that tipping point. And now the time is to get your people prepared. So the collectives that I heard Sacagawea talking about are wonderful because that's what's going to happen. That's what's going to have to happen. We are very individualistic. We talk about millennials, this other generation, but when we're talking about justice, when we're talking about Indigenous peoples, we need to have a trauma informed lens. So what does that mean? A trauma informed lens. It means we see the past. We speak the truth to the past. It's not about a past that has been written by liars who just simply want to eliminate and eradicate Indigenous peoples. It's about telling the truth. It's about uh, seeing why we are where we are today and what do we want for the future. And I think an economy that like the priorities of government, both Canada and the US, and indeed most of the world, is energy and economic security. And that's really short sighted. It's really a short sighted vision of what to make for future generations. So, so when we talk about colonization and that it's still going on, we also are talking about some of the things that we have in common with the general population, which is climate change. Now, the former Special Rapporteur, James Anaya, talked about climate change being the biggest threat to Indigenous peoples today. We have Pacific Island countries they don't have a land base anymore. And Canada and the US have rejected these Pacific Islanders, so they're gone to other countries. But what we need to talk about is food, not just food sovereignty, but food sustainability. For us, we have to have access to our lands. Our land base is shrinking, development goes on, and Canada decides, and the US, through anthropologists or archaeologists, oh, well, we have this disappeared St. Lawrence Iroquois who lived here, and that's not you guys. And so we have to always go to courts in an adversarial role instead of looking at things in the UN, like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that could be a framework for rebuilding a relationship that has been broken and still remains broken. And so I'm not sure how long I have, but anyways. So one of the things I also hear is, our society is complicated. It's complicated because there's so much ignorance and racism in the world. That's what complicates things. And for people who are unbudging in their ideology, that they're always right, instead of looking at, well, what about educating the youth, the children, on the real truth, the real history. I mean, a lot of times when Canada has adopted a lot of the US culture in the TV or in the icons that we see. And people talk a lot about the mosaic of people that have come to the Americas. And they always exclude Indigenous peoples. And they treat us as if, okay, oh, this is a Native American headdress. This is a Native American language. There's no such thing. There's no such thing. I speak Kanyakahaga. I'm Kanyakahaga. I don't speak the same language as the Sioux. I don't speak the same language as the Hopi or the Dene, and so on. And so it's a real injustice when people melt us all together as one people. And I think that too has to change. And so when we're talking about decolonizing, let's decolonize how we talk about each other. Let's talk about gender equality for Iroquois people. It's the women who are caretakers of the land. And we have an imposed colonial system that put up and recognized male leadership, but only through the government of Canada's, rubber stamping everything. If it strayed from their agenda, it was not accepted. So we have a lot of reports at the UN. And I know that in the US you have civil rights more than human rights, and which I think should change, because you wouldn't have the kind of ignorance that constantly keeps people of color, and indigenous peoples to the point where we're the most impoverished. We have the highest rates of suicide. Um, and we're looking at ways to sustain things, but it's not going to happen if colonization continues. It's not going to happen if we're not all on the same page and understand that this little blue planet that we're on, it's very delicate. We're surrounded by radiation in the galaxy, and we're destroying the things that Mother Earth has put up to protect us. I'm not sure if I'm going overboard here, but I guess there'll be more times for question. I have 1 minute left. Okay. Um, so I think it's really important that if you want to look at some of the international human rights, it's their International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, but also to have indigenous people as part of the decision making process, not exclude us and constantly use us as a footnote in history the way Canada and the US are trying to do, which is totally marginalization, which is not reflective of a true democracy. And to bring that gender equality back into the decision making process, and to bring in the equality as well for Mother Earth and all our relations, because we do not have the birds, if we do not have the bees, trees, all of these things that keep us alive. Um, this will be a dead planet, and there will be no jobs on a dead planet. So climate change, I think, is something that we need to address if we're planning things, and helping people out, educating those children, because we have to help them uh, be prepared for the challenges that are coming because of climate change. So thank you very much, and I look forward to some more discussion.
Okay. Luvanaka. My name is Miriam. And again, kudos to everything that has been said before this. It's nothing but facts. Um, so, what I would like to talk about, and Adrian and I, we think it's really important that when we're talking about housing displacement and resisting it, um, that folks who are most impacted need to be part of the conversations for change. And that's where the solutions are going to come from. Um, and so I just want to start by talking about Black land loss, because Black folks, Indigenous folks, immigrants, refugees, we are always the ones that are most impacted by displacement and dispossession. And Black folks continue, especially here in Tacoma, continue to be at the tail end of housing justice. And so I would like to talk about how Black folks, with that, throughout the history of the United States, have forever been in the struggle. Starting at the turn of the 20th century, that is at where we were at the height of having Black land ownership, and it was mostly due to farmers in the South. So about 15 million acres of land belonged to Black farmers. And from there, the numbers continued to dwindle down. In 1920, 925,000 African American farmers represented 14% of the farmers in America. And by the time 1975 came by, the number was down to 600,000. And now to this day, of the 1 billion acres of arable land in America, Black people own little than 1 million acres, and we make up less than 1% of farmers in general. Um, and the way that that came to be was through a lot of terror. It wasn't that Black folks just stopped wanting to be farmers. People were terrorized when we were free, when we became free. A lot of white domestic terror that drove people up to the north, to the Midwest, to the West. Um, Folks who were trying to keep their land were being denied of farm loans. Their harassment and discrimination complaints were being ignored, because once it was 2 years that the complaint went in and was unresponded to, it got thrown out. So a lot of folks that's where a lot of our cooperations and collectives came from, was because we had to band together to protect our land and to protect one another. And through all the terror and economic exploitation. Um, Over 6 million Black people relocated from the South to the North, Midwest, and West between 1916 and 1970. And even to this day, those who remain in the South still fight to remain ownership over their farmlands. Um, yeah, totally. Yeah. And the results of Black folks and not having access to their land, having access to the land and having access to safe land continues to be a struggle today. Um, and that continued to be a systemic struggle through redlining, which I'm sure many of you may know about. But redlining was a practice which determined which neighborhoods were deemed safe or extremely dangerous depending on the number of Black folks living in that neighborhood. Redlining impacted folks' ability to access home loans, the quality and safety of schools, access to resources, access to healthy and affordable food, and access to quality living environments in regards to environmental justice. And it's really important that we talk about this very real history that Black folks have endured in relation to land and ownership and being displaced. Because as we talk about Tacoma now, it adds more context and it adds the importance of why Black folks and folks that have historically been impacted by this should be at the table when we talk about solutions.
My name is Adrian. I am going to give you some data because that's what I do, I research. So first I would like to acknowledge the land that we're on right now and whose land this really is, and so this is for the natives. I just wanted to acknowledge that. I'm here to talk about what I know about the state of Black housing in Tacoma, particularly in Hilltop. I do want to say that engaging in this kind of work for Black liberation is hard, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. I also want to say that we face a lot of harsh realities out here, such as not having access to land or having a legacy of Black landowners in our family. And according to a recent report, Black people are more likely to become homeless than people of other racial and ethnic backgrounds in Pierce County. From the loss and sacrifices endured by the indigenous community to the Black and brown bodies whose blood still runs through these streets, the history of this community is something we'd like all of our guests to acknowledge and to be aware of, and who truly benefits from development such as the light rail and who actually suffers the consequences because of it. Okay. The cost of living for a family of 4 in Tacoma, 2 adults, 2 children, in the metro area is around over $83,000 annually. A white family of 4 actually earns, their median income is around $72,000, while Black families around $51,000 a year. So I'm trying to show you the disparities that Black folks in Tacoma face. 47.5% of Black families of 4 qualify for some degree of public assistance. 33% of Black single people qualify. Home ownership for whites is at 57%, while home ownership for Black is at 32%. Tacoma as a whole, however, and especially in Hilltop, there's a higher rate of rented housing rather than owner-occupied, and the median rental prices for a 1-bedroom has increased by 74%. To afford a 2-bedroom in Pierce County, workers at minimum wage would need to work more than 2 full-time jobs to be able to afford housing. And I also wanted you to know that more than half of all the jobs in the Pacific Northwest pay less than $20 an hour, and you have to be able to make over $22 an hour to afford housing. In Pierce County, 69% of all low-income households pay more than 30% of income for housing expenses, and 38% pay more than 50% for income of their income for housing expenses. Federal data show that white families today earn nearly 10 times the net worth of Black families, and it'll take Black people 242 years to catch up to white wealth if white wealth stopped accumulating today. So on the whole, rents could rise as much as 46% in the next 10 years. Increase in housing costs have outpaced increases in household incomes. The median home value has risen by 31%, rent has increased by 23%, income has only increased by 10%. In 2017, Hilltop offered limited affordable housing options for low-income renters. Many Hilltop residents can't and couldn't keep up with the pace of rising house costs. Just a side note, $100 increase in rent equals 15% increase in homelessness. In Pierce County, the chances of living to 77 years are 5 times higher in communities with a lower percentage of people of color. Then, yeah, and in certain areas, whites have received 100% mortgage funding for moving in certain areas in Tacoma. I also wanted to talk about the migration. In 2017, Tacoma hosted one of the top 10 zip codes for gentrification nationally. Between 2010 and 2015, 35% of African American population vacated Hilltop. In 2015, white residents increased from 48 to 51%, and decrease of black residents went from 25 to 21%, and Hispanics went from 11 to 9. It's also important to note that there is a limited amount of affordable rentals units in Hilltop, and these reasons include occupancy by higher income households, growth in units not targeted to households with lowest incomes, and loss of units priced for extremely low income households. 1/3 of Pierce County household residents are suffering from cost burdens, and to afford a 2-bedroom in Pierce County, a worker at minimum wage would need to work more than 2 full-time jobs to afford housing. Why is this so important to me? So I have a bachelor's degree. I have an education. I have lived experiences. I'm very resourceful, but also I found me and my family homeless, not for the first time, for like the 3rd time, and last year for 9 months. All the services and organizations that I went to for help could not help me. I wasn't on drugs, I had an education, and I wasn't in domestic violence. So I was turned away a lot of the time. And the only reason I'm able to be here today, the only reason I was able to make it is because community members stepped up where organizations and nonprofits couldn't help me. And so I'm a part of the work because I know where the gaps are. I know that my lived experience is just as valid as anybody with a professional degree. And I believe also what Miriam was saying, that you cannot change the problem if you don't allow people like me to be a part of the conversation and for you to listen to my voice just as much as you would anybody else. Thank you for your time. Side note, I also am hosting a People's Movement Assembly called the Backyard Boogie for Justice 253, where we'll be talking about housing, gentrification, and homelessness, and Miriam will be one of our guest speakers.
Hey everybody, I'm so glad to be here. I want to thank Courtney, Saki, Ellen, Adrian, and Miriam. I didn't forget anyone, did I? I think I got everybody for their words of wisdom, and thank you all for making time to be here today. Hello. So I want to commiserate a little bit with you. Though I did my doctorate in an urban planning program at MIT, I've had a serious ambivalence with planning. For obvious reasons, hopefully, to you, but I'll get into them. In fact, I've been in a several years slow burn kind of anger about planning and what the hell is the point of planning. And I found the need to kind of travel literally away from planning and theoretically. And I've immersed myself in mothering. I have 2 children. In teaching undergraduates, which I call my babies, and I know that's ageist and wrong, and in community-based organizing, where I live in South Orange, New Jersey, all around Queensbridge. So that's how I plan right now, and I talk to planners struggling with the emotion in planning, the stuff we are not taught to work with and for. So I found my way back to you planners, for those planners in the room. I'm back, and my message is this. Planners and designers, however you plan and design, whether you're a gardener, a community volunteer for the homeless shelter, a local organizer against big chain stores, an educator of any and every kind, a city paid researcher, or whatever you are, a parent advocate, a parks and bicycle advocate, an architect, an engineer who's overpaid, you know who you are. We are here to do one thing and one thing only. Ready? I put my life on this. I stake my life on these words. We are here to facilitate healing, full stop, period. That is our job, to facilitate healing, okay? We are here to honor each other, the earth, and the dead. There is nothing else. So whatever else you're doing, regroup. We're here to help each other heal. On this planet, there's no planet B. This is it. Places are a narrative of values and experiences. I ask you to consider what values are you centering. So planners, we must be artists of every kind in our healing work. Healing is the work that can confront, as Ta-Nehisi Coates said in the reparations hearing yesterday, this dilemma of inheritance that we have, especially in the United States, but really everywhere. Consider that for planners of a bygone era, for cis-het, rich, white, male planners, planning was a vocation, right? It was something that you could afford to do. I'm telling you that's a lie. The consequences are too important, they're gargantuan. Planning is something we must do. But it has to be the right kind of planning. It has to be planning based in abolition. It has to be about love. Planning has to be a calling, not a paycheck. So why am I saying this? Because never again is now. We are in a serious crisis. Never again is now. You are organizing space that we share, as the people who spoke before me so eloquently spoke about. The life we share, the histories, the traumas, the spirits, and the futures we share. You're organizing how we live and what we see, the places we are born into, live, work, play, love, suffer in, despair, hunger, and die. This and these are the spaces in which you plan. So planners, we need you to tell the truth. We need you to tell the truth. Today, this morning, Eric Africa was paroled after 41 years in prison following the state of Pennsylvania's attack on Route 9, Philadelphia in 1978 and 1985. I went to one of the best planning programs in the world, ostensibly, MIT. And I love MIT, though I've had a fraught relationship with that experience. I never learned about the Route 9 in my studies at one of the best planning programs in the world. The MOVE organization was a Black liberation group founded in 1972 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania by John Africa and Donna Glassie, a social worker from the University of Pennsylvania. They lived in a communal setting. They care about the environment. They were Black, radical, hippie-dippie types. They were shot up, they were murdered, 6 children dead, and MOVE 9 incarcerated for several decades. So blessings and prayers up for the entire Africa family and for Delbert and Chuck still incarcerated. I have the humble honor of doing some research on space and grief and healing right now with Mike Africa Jr. and with my students on these haunted places we call cities. So planners, more than anything, we need you to honor the dead, the dying, the lost, the scared, the shamed, the depressed, the anxious, the suicidal, and the ignored. These people are buried alive. They walk amongst us. They are us. They might be you. You might be pretending right now and not realize it. History lives in all these spaces and places. And every day we have another chance to be different kinds of planners. Because we are planning while we grieve. So you might say, okay, I'm in, I believe you. We need to heal. How do I do it? Well, you have to organize relentlessly. You have to recognize you'll get tired and defeated. You have to regroup, build your community, get up, and try again. That is the answer. It is not easy. You have to be relentless. You have to proceed with an awareness that cities, neighborhoods, suburbs, farms, schools, mountains, fields, prisons, parking lots, kitchens, bridges, trains, these all embody philosophy, spatial philosophy, spiritual philosophy, future philosophy. We have to fight the cynics who peddle ideas about false scarcity in the midst of abundance in all those places I just named. We all know, hopefully in this room, about systemic racism, sexual, gender, and religious oppression, systemic poverty, historic and ongoing militarism, climate change, environmental justice, the moral depravity and disregard around the aged, the disabled, the sick, those in danger, and those forgotten. What are we going to do about this as planners? Are we just going to be in our books writing papers? That can't be it. That can't be the answer. Recently, a study came out that showed that $700 billion in Pentagon spending, more than the height of Vietnam, is what we're dealing with. What are we going to do about that? Do you feel that we have a responsibility to respond to such things? In my teaching with the babies, who are not babies, they're 20, 21, 22, 23 years old, we talk about Margot Crawford, who has written about public interiority, where she revisits the work of the Black arts movement to replace the Black interior into our public consciousness. We talk about Clyde Woods, who's written about a blues epistemology, which helps us reframe the terrain of knowledge and therefore of possibility. We talk about Catherine McKittrick, who has written about Black women's struggles as landed, as bodily, and as psychic experiences that need to be reckoned with. We talk about Nadia Ellis, who has written about the longing of the diasporic experience as a constituting force, a queer force, a force for belonging, because our crowns have already been paid for many times over. And we talk about Fred Moulton and Stefano Harney, who have written about the undercommons, which is the place that planners should be. The undercommons, that spatial poetics that we exist in and through, always in a context of ongoing capitalism, slavery, militarism, colonization, patriarchy. We talk about Winona LaDuke, who has written on the imperative to recover the sacred by naming and claiming our past for our future. I could go on and on, but you can come to my abolition and a Black Kids Play session at 3. And we talk about art. So yes, my disciplinary heritage is in urban planning, and before that in anthropology. But these days, the Black arts movement is how I understand the future and how I try to help planners who encounter me at conferences like ACSP, etc. and so forth. And usually I read poetry to them. And so I'm going to read you a poem. In the spirit of the Black arts movement, I'm going to work to amplify a Black poet named Ross Gay. And some of you know me, so you've heard me say this poem over and over, and this is what I do now. I just repeat this poem wherever I am. It's called A Small Needful Fact. A small needful fact is that Eric Gardner worked for some time for the Parks and Rec Horticultural Department, which means perhaps that with his very large hands, perhaps in all likelihood, he put gently into the earth some plants, which most likely some of them in all likelihood continue to grow, continue to do what such plants do, like house and feed small and necessary creatures, like being pleasant to touch and smell, like converting sunlight into food, like making it easier for us to breathe. So I think I'm going to end there because we're a little bit late and I like to end on poetry. I can't wait to talk with you more. Thank you for this panel.
You know, the UN is an entity that was created by states, and so states will receive very diplomatic kind of criticism, and they always try and do the minimum amount of upholding human rights. They try to do the least amount of work of any kind of criticism any human rights body has. And so they tout out people who are doing whatever the government's agenda is, often, not always. But I would say that they don't work with the UN unless it's the UN security, unless it has to do with economic agreements. You know, the Convention on Biodiversity, when they were talking about mutually benefit sharing, because you have 76% of pharmaceuticals that come from traditional knowledge. You have companies like Monsanto there. And so it's a game, and Indigenous people always have to work harder to protect their rights, and often it's only at the discretion of the states So the UN is good in one way, but it's extremely challenging because oftentimes we don't have the resources to do it. There are activists who are going out there. I think the UN is a nice idea, but you know, U.S. and Canada manipulate totally all the things. Although it's a very big propaganda machine, but I don't want to give up hope on it because I think it should be something that the global community has the ability to achieve some kind of justice at that level.
I'll take a stab. So I'm feeling edgy. So what do we mean by solutions? Do you mean policy prescriptions? If you need policy prescriptions, it's going to be a little bit difficult. The right kinds of policies come about through sustained organizing. There are no shortcuts. So there are no shortcuts to solutions. You can't like fast forward to that spot on your Netflix show, right? It requires sustained, agitated, uncomfortable organizing, right? But if you really want to know what I think, and then I'm happy to pass it over, we need universal health care, universal education, universal child care, universal basic income, universal access to housing, including the development of community land trusts and housing cooperatives and mutual aid society. We need shared responsibility for the raising of children and care work we need for seniors and elderly. We need community-based energy grids and community training opportunities, et cetera, and so forth. But there's no shortcut to any of this work, right? It requires sustained organizing, and for those faculty in the room, I say this with deep respect, it also requires that you see yourselves as organizers in the classroom. So what you're doing as educators, I'm speaking to the faculty, right, and TAs, is that you're organizing your classrooms. You have to decolonize your classroom. You have to rethink the hierarchy in your classroom and to check the histories that you're propagating in your syllabus, right? And that is one way, one step that we get there. There's no shortcuts.
So I wanted to add on to what Ellen was saying. I mean, there's like so she spoke to the limits around the United Nations, and like the U.S. moratorium or undermining like even treaties and things that it says that it espouses to and agrees to and conventions that it has like ratified. But I think that like a major thing is that like for people to become aware of what the UN instruments are and what different tools are. Like Ellen was talking about the indigenous peoples. You mentioned like civil and political rights, but like, and people in the U.S. know civil and political rights, but people don't know about economic, social, and cultural rights, and that's for a reason. And so I think that like I used to work for the U.S. Human Rights Network, which talked about people-centered human rights. That it's like our responsibility as people to be holding the United States or Canada or whomever accountable, and like the tools and what gets researched and what gets created and what gets documented is only but so helpful if people aren't able to use them in their everyday work and their organizing. I think that that's part of the strength of like what can and does come out, and like all of the like hard fought efforts that people have, and just like the leadership of indigenous peoples around being able to push and to be able to like actually have, I think, had a lot of success with the UN and creating these tools. But then like it can't stop there because it has to get used, and like everybody needs to. I think that like everybody needs to. And I guess even just thinking about like planners, like to be thinking about like and knowing about like and learning about like what is that, what is it, what does it say, and how does that impact the work that I'm doing, and how I even am thinking and speaking and planning. I was a part of the work around the the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination for a long time. I think like there was just like decades and decades of work for people of African descent to make space and have a decade and now have a permanent forum. And it's just like so much of what goes into and then what comes out of the United Nations as a body doesn't get talked about. And so I think there needs to be like popularizing the information that comes out of it, and just like constantly being able to shine the light on the fact that like the United States and Canada don't adhere and uphold to what principles it says it actually is like supposed to be going around championing, right, or being like the best at like constantly. And so there's like UN rapporteurs on housing that have been here and have done a whole lot of work that could be really helpful to the folks in Washington to be able to incorporate and to be able to start talking about and using a human rights framework really expands on what you are saying like the solutions are, right? So like there's a limit to civil rights in so many ways, and looking at it as like something that has to be taken to the courts, but that's not the case if you're looking at it in a broader human rights framework. So I wanted to offer that.
I wanted to talk a bit about everything that we're doing, which is, you know, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a framework to renew those broken relationships. You know, there's a lot of beautiful conventions and declarations at the UN. Eleanor Roosevelt was the one that helped write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But they're just words on paper unless people actualize them and believe them. They're just words on paper until people actually use them and understand what you're talking about. And for us, we're using those international human rights tools along with our own, because the Iroquois people have Painaratserapoa, which is the shining great law of peace. And so you need respect, courage, love in order to get peace, right? So when I heard the term case studies, and perhaps as an activist and non-academic, it sends up a lot of red flags for me, because we are the most researched people, I think, in the world. I think what needs to do is do case studies on settlers on why they resist so much the rights of indigenous peoples. That's the case study that we need, because we know what our history. We still have our languages, and we have rights. We are sovereign people. We never gave that up. I don't consider myself a Canadian citizen, and so it's really about why is there so much resistance? Why is there so much racism? And we can help lead that way, but it is again, words only come to life through the people, but the people are also need to take care of the land and all the relations who are losing their habitats because of condo development, because of we live in the country down this way, and nobody's tearing down buildings, they're tearing up earth, and so each situation is unique and has to be treated as such, and to meet the needs of the land, the inhabitants, like the four-leggeds or the fish or whoever, and the people, because we're not separate. It's one right. Thank you.